I'm Nora Caldwell. I'm 32 years old, and I'm an executive director at Pinnacle Tech in Chicago, where I run operations for our whole Midwest division, managing 5 facilities and a team of 42 people. My world got turned upside down last Tuesday when my sister Lila Prescott called me out of nowhere and dropped a bomb that still makes my blood boil. My dad, Howard Vance, who everyone calls Howie, told her to make sure I knew I wasn't welcome at the big party he's throwing for him and my mom, Marion Ellison's 35th wedding anniversary. I was sprawled on my couch in my apartment, half distracted by a work email, when Lila's voice came through the phone, all shaky like she was scared to even say it. She just blurted it out. "Dad says you can't come to the anniversary celebration." I froze, my fingers hovering over my laptop keyboard, feeling like someone had just slammed a door in my face. "What do you mean I can't come?" I asked, my voice getting loud because I could already feel this hot wave of anger rising in my chest. Lila hesitated, like she was searching for words to make it hurt less, but there was no way to sugarcoat this. "He said you'd make the whole event about you and your big career, and it's supposed to be about Mom and him celebrating their marriage." Lila told me, her voice tight with frustration, like she was mad at Dad too, but didn't know how to push back. I gripped my phone so hard I thought it might crack, trying to wrap my head around why my own father would do something so cold. This wasn't just some random family get-together. This was a huge deal, 35 years of marriage for my parents, and I'd already blocked off my calendar months ago to be there. I'd spent weeks working on a special gift for them, a handcrafted photo album packed with restored pictures from their early days together, including some old ones of Mom's great-grandparents I'd dug up in our attic back in Cedar Grove, Indiana. I'd shelled out $2,000 to get those photos professionally preserved because I knew Mom would treasure them. And now Dad was saying I couldn't even show up to give it to her. I took a deep breath and asked Lila if she was serious, if this was really what Dad meant. She let out a long sigh and said she'd tried to talk him out of it, begged him to reconsider, but he wouldn't budge. He kept saying, "You're too wrapped up in your high-flying corporate world to care about a small-town party," Lila explained, and I could hear the strain in her voice, like she hated being the messenger. That hit me hard because it was such a lie. Sure, my job keeps me busy running supply chains and troubleshooting production issues, but I always made time for family, especially for Mom. She's been my rock my whole life, slipping me articles about women leaders when I was a teenager, whispering to me to chase my dreams even when Dad would scoff and tell me to get my head out of the clouds. Growing up in Cedar Grove, he was a floor manager at a local factory, and to him that was the top of the ladder for people like us. He'd say things like, "Nora, you're bright, but you need to know your limits," and Mom would just grab my hand under the table, her way of telling me to tune him out. Those quiet moments with her got me through years of his put-downs, and now he was trying to shut me out of her special day. I asked Lila if Mom knew about this, if she was okay with Dad's decision. Lila got real quiet, then said, "Mom doesn't know it's a surprise party, and Dad's been telling everyone you're too busy to make it." That's when I felt the anger turn into something sharper, because not only was he banning me, he was spinning a story to make me look like the one who didn't care about my parents' milestone. I ended the call with Lila and just sat there, my mind spinning like a hamster wheel. I kept thinking about all the times Dad had cut me down, like when I earned a full scholarship to Northwestern for business administration, and he called it a pointless expense, even though it cost him nothing. Or when I got my first big promotion at Pinnacle Tech, and he brushed it off, saying I was just chasing some corporate fantasy that wouldn't last. Every one of those moments came rushing back, and I realized this wasn't just about the anniversary party. This was him trying to keep me small, to shove me back into the box he'd always wanted me to stay in. I grabbed my phone again and dialed Mom, not to ruin the surprise, but to see if I could get a read on what was happening. When she answered, her voice was warm but heavy, like she was carrying a weight she couldn't talk about. "Hey, sweetheart," she said, "it's so good to hear from you." I kept it casual, asked about her weekend, said I was thinking of swinging by soon. She paused for a second, then said, "Oh, your father's planning something for us, probably just a small dinner." I could hear this quiet ache in her voice when she added, "I wish you could be here, Nora. It's been too long since we've all been together." That broke something in me because I knew she had no idea Dad was keeping me away on purpose. Before we hung up, she said something that stuck with me: "No matter what happens, I love you always." It felt like she was reaching out across the miles trying to tell me something was wrong, but she couldn't say it outright. I barely slept that night, my brain replaying Dad's words and Mom's voice over and over. The next morning, I met my best friend Rhea Townsend for coffee at our favorite spot in Lincoln Park. I spilled everything, told her how Dad banned me, how he was lying to everyone, how Mom didn't even know. Rhea listened, her eyes getting narrower with every word, and when I was done, she leaned across the table and said, "Nora, let me make sure I've got this right. Your dad is trying to erase you from your parents' 35th anniversary because he's got some chip on his shoulder about your success, and you're actually thinking about letting him get away with it." I tried to explain that I didn't want to stir up drama, that showing up could ruin the day for Mom, but Rhea cut me off. She said, "Your mom wants you there," you heard it in her voice. "And if you don't go, you're letting your dad run this family like he always has." Her words landed like a spark because she was dead right. I'd spent years building a career proving him wrong, and now he was trying to take away my place at my own parents' celebration. I felt the anger shift into something clearer, a kind of resolve I hadn't tapped into in a long time. That's when I decided I was going to that anniversary party no matter what Howie Vance said. I wasn't just going to sneak in, I was going to walk through that door with my head up, hand Mom and Dad that photo album, and make sure Mom knew I'd never choose to miss their big moment. I got to work right away, booked a flight to Indianapolis for Friday night, reserved a room at a hotel 5 miles from my parents' house in Cedar Grove, so I wouldn't have to stay with Lila and risk Dad finding out. I called Lila, told her I was coming, but made her promise not to breathe a word to anyone, especially Dad. She sounded worried, said it could get ugly, but I could hear a hint of relief in her voice, like she was glad I was standing up to him. Then she said something that made my stomach drop. She said a few weeks ago she'd found an old letter in Mom's sewing box addressed to someone named Iona, and Dad had lost it when he saw it, told her to put it back and never mention it again. I asked what was in the letter, but Lila said she didn't read it, just saw the name, and Dad's reaction. That was the first clue something bigger was going on, something Dad was desperate to keep me away from. I didn't know what it was yet, but it lit a fire in me to show up, to face him, and to figure out what he was hiding from me and from Mom. So there I was on a Friday evening, stepping off a plane in Indianapolis, my stomach in knots. But my mind made up. I was going to my parents' 35th wedding anniversary celebration in Cedar Grove, no matter what my dad, Howard Vance, who everyone calls Howie, had said about me not being welcome. I'd spent the whole flight replaying that call from my sister Lila Prescott when she told me Dad banned me because I'd supposedly turned the whole event into my own personal spotlight, and I could still feel the sting of his words like a slap across the face. I grabbed my carry-on, which had the photo album I'd spent $3,000 restoring for Mom and Dad, packed carefully in a box with tissue paper, and headed straight to the rental car desk because I wasn't wasting a second. I'd booked a room at a hotel 5 miles from my parents' house in Cedar Grove, not because I wanted to be fancy, but because I needed a place to regroup without Lila or anyone else tipping Dad off that I was coming. Driving those familiar roads back to my hometown, I kept thinking about Mom, whose real name is Marion, but we all call her Mari, and how her voice sounded so sad on the phone when she said she wished I could be there. That memory fueled me, pushed me to keep going, even though part of me was terrified of what might happen when I walked into that party. I checked into the hotel, dropped my bag on the bed, and pulled out the album just to make sure it was still perfect, because that gift was my way of showing Mom I'd never choose to miss her big day no matter what Dad said. Saturday morning, I woke up early, my nerves jangling like loose change, but I forced myself to focus. Lila had texted me the details. The party was at a community hall in Cedar Grove, starting at 3 in the afternoon, with most guests arriving by 3:30, and Mom and Dad were supposed to show up at 4, under the pretense of picking up something before their fake dinner plans. I spent the morning going over my plan, pacing the hotel room, trying to figure out how to walk into that hall without letting Dad's words get under my skin. I called Lila to confirm everything, and her voice was all tense like she was walking on eggshells. She said Dad's been acting weird all week, snapping at everyone and double-checking the guest list like he's paranoid. Someone uninvited might show up. I asked if she'd heard anything else about that letter she found in Mom's sewing box, the one addressed to Iona, that made Dad flip out, and she got real quiet. She said she hadn't looked at it again, but yesterday, she overheard Dad on the phone talking to someone in a low voice saying something about keeping the past buried. That sent a chill through me because it wasn't just about me anymore. There was something bigger going on, something Dad was desperate to hide, and it made me wonder if that's why he didn't want me at the party. I told Lila to keep her eyes open and reminded her not to tell anyone I was coming, not even her boyfriend Silas Morrow, who I hadn't met yet, but who she kept saying was excited to meet me. By noon, I was a bundle of nerves, but I made myself get ready, picking out a simple gray dress that said, "I'm here for Mom and Dad, not to show off," because the last thing I wanted was to give Dad ammunition to say I was making it about me. I packed the photo album and a bouquet of roses I'd picked up at a local florist because Mom loves them, and headed to the community hall about a mile from my parents' house. I parked a block away at 2:45, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. From the car, I could see cars pulling into the lot and people heading inside with balloons and gift bags, the buzz of a celebration already starting. Lila texted me that Dad was there setting up, looking stressed, and that Mom was still at home, oblivious to the surprise. I sat there gripping the steering wheel, trying to decide if I should go in early or wait until Mom arrived, because every second I waited felt like a chance to lose my nerve. I kept thinking about all the times Dad had made me feel small, like last Thanksgiving when I showed up late from a work crisis, and he announced to the whole family that I was too important for regular people's schedules. Or the time I got promoted to director and he laughed it off, saying I was just a cog in a machine that didn't care about folks like us. Those memories burned, and I realized I wasn't just doing this for Mom. I was doing it for me, to prove I wasn't the person he kept trying to paint me as. At 3:15, I couldn't wait anymore. I grabbed the album and the flowers, took a deep breath, and started walking toward the hall, my legs shaky, but my resolve solid. The closer I got, the louder the chatter and laughter from inside became, and I could feel every eye that might turn on me when I stepped through that door. I reached the entrance, my hand hovering over the handle, and for a split second I thought about turning back, because I knew Dad would make this ugly. But then I heard Mom's voice in my head saying, "I love you always," and I pushed the door open. The room was packed with relatives and family friends, aunts and uncles and neighbors, all milling around with drinks and plates of food, the place decked out with silver and gold decorations for the anniversary. I spotted Lila across the room, her eyes going wide when she saw me, and she started weaving through the crowd toward me. Before she could get there, Dad appeared out of nowhere, his face going from fake cheerful to stone cold the second he recognized me. "Nora," he said, his voice low and sharp, like he was trying to keep the guests from hearing. "What the hell are you doing here?" That moment, standing there with Dad glaring at me like I was an intruder in my own family's celebration, was like every fight we'd ever had rolled into one. I felt the anger surge, but I kept my voice steady and said, "I'm here for Mom and Dad's anniversary because I wouldn't miss it for anything." His eyes narrowed and he stepped closer, almost blocking the doorway, and said, "I told Lila you weren't invited. This is about your mother and me, not another chance for you to parade your big city success in front of everyone." I was about to fire back when Lila reached us, her face pale but determined, and she grabbed my arm, whispering, "Nora, maybe you should wait outside until Mom gets here." Dad cut her off, his voice rising just enough to draw a few curious glances from nearby guests, and said, "No, she needs to leave now before she ruins everything." That's when I felt something snap inside me, because I was done letting him rewrite my place in this family. I looked him right in the eye and said, "I'm not going anywhere, Dad. I'm here for Mom, and I'm staying until she gets here." The room got quieter as people started noticing the tension, and I could see Aunt Fern Whitaker and Uncle Cliff Hargrove watching from a corner, their faces a mix of confusion and concern. Dad's jaw tightened and he opened his mouth to say something else, but before he could, a woman I didn't recognize stepped forward from the crowd, her face vaguely familiar but hard to place. She was older, maybe in her 60s, with sharp eyes, and she said in a calm but firm voice, "Howard, I think you should let Nora stay. After all, she's family." Dad froze, his face going white like he'd seen a ghost, and I realized this woman, whoever she was, knew something that scared him. Lila whispered to me, "That's Iona," the name from the letter, and my heart skipped a beat because suddenly I knew the secret Dad was hiding was standing right in front of me. Standing there in the community hall in Cedar Grove with my dad, Howard Vance, who everyone calls Howie, glaring at me like I was some stranger crashing his party. I felt the weight of every argument we'd ever had pressing down on me, but I wasn't backing down, not after he'd banned me from my parents' 35th wedding anniversary celebration and lied to everyone that I was too busy to care. I'd just told him I was staying for Mom, whose real name is Marion, but we all call her Mari, and I could feel the eyes of relatives and friends boring into me as the tension thickened like a storm cloud. My sister Lila Prescott was next to me, her hand on my arm, whispering for me to wait outside. But before I could respond, this woman, Iona Merritt, the one Lila said was named in that mysterious letter, stepped forward and told Dad he should let me stay. Her voice calm but sharp enough to cut through the noise. Dad's face went pale like he'd been caught doing something he shouldn't, and I knew, right then, this wasn't just about me showing up uninvited. There was something he was terrified of coming out. I looked at Lila and she mouthed Iona's name, confirming this was the person from Mom's letter, and my heart was racing because I could sense the whole room shifting like we were all standing on the edge of something big. Dad opened his mouth to argue, but before he could say anything, the hall doors swung open and Mom walked in, her face lighting up with surprise as everyone shouted congratulations for the anniversary. She hadn't seen me yet, and I felt this mix of relief and dread because I knew the moment she did, everything would explode. Mom made her way through the crowd, hugging aunts and uncles like Cliff Hargrove and Fern Whitaker, her smile so genuine it made my chest ache because she had no idea about the fight brewing. I stayed near the edge of the room, clutching the photo album I'd spent $3,000 restoring, and the roses I'd brought for her, trying to keep my cool while Dad shot me death glares from across the hall. Iona had melted back into the crowd, but I could feel her watching like she was waiting for the right moment to stir things up again. Lila stayed close, whispering that Mom was going to be so happy I came, but I could tell she was nervous about Dad's next move. Then Mom's eyes found me, and she froze, her smile faltering for a second before turning into this huge grin that made me want to cry. "Nora," she called out, pushing past people to get to me, and when she hugged me so tight I could barely breathe, I felt like I'd made the right choice, no matter what Dad thought. "Happy anniversary, Mom," I said, handing her the roses and the album, my voice shaking a little because I was so afraid she'd get caught in the crossfire. She took them, her hands trembling as she looked at the album's cover and said, "You didn't have to do this, sweetheart. Just having you here is enough." That's when Dad stormed over, his face red with anger, and he said loud enough for everyone nearby to hear, "Well, isn't this just perfect? Nora swooping in to make it all about her?" The room went quiet again, people turning to stare, and I felt that old familiar sting of his words. But this time, I wasn't letting him win. I was about to snap back when Mom put a hand on Dad's arm and said, "Howie, stop it. She's our daughter, and she's here for us." Dad shook her off and said she wasn't invited. "Mari, this is our day, not another stage for her corporate ego." I felt the anger boil over, and I said, "Dad, I'm here because I love you and Mom, and I'm not the one making a scene right now, you are." A few guests gasped, and I could see Aunt Fern whispering to Uncle Cliff, their faces shocked, because nobody ever talked back to Dad like that. Before Dad could respond, a guy I hadn't noticed before stood up from a table near Lila and walked over, his face a mix of confusion and recognition. He was tall with dark hair, and Lila grabbed his arm, saying, "Silas, this isn't the time." But he shook his head and looked right at me. "I'm Silas Morrow," he said, extending his hand, "Lila's boyfriend, but also Nora. You're Nora Caldwell from Pinnacle Tech. You're my boss." The words hit like a thunderbolt, and the whole room went dead silent, every single person staring at me, then at Dad, whose mouth opened, but nothing came out. Silas kept going like he didn't realize he'd just dropped a bomb and said, "I work at the Indianapolis branch we opened 4 months ago, and Ms. Caldwell runs our entire Midwest operation. She's the one who turned our supply chain around and made the branch possible." I stood there frozen, my mind racing because I had no idea Silas was Lila's boyfriend, or that he worked for me, but his words were like a wrecking ball smashing through every lie Dad had told about my career. Dad looked like he'd been slapped. His face drained of color, and he stammered something about it being a small world, but nobody was listening to him anymore. Aunt Fern stepped closer, her eyes wide, and said, "Howard, you never told us Nora was running a whole company. That's incredible." Mom grabbed my hand, her eyes shining with pride, and said, "We've always been so proud of her, haven't we, Howie?" Her voice firm, like she was daring him to disagree. The room buzzed with whispers as people started asking me questions about my job, genuine curiosity replacing the awkward glances from before. I tried to answer, but my head was spinning because Silas's revelation had changed everything. Dad's story about me being some self-absorbed corporate wannabe was crumbling in front of everyone. Then Iona Merritt stepped forward again, her presence like a dark cloud, and she said in a voice that carried across the hall, "Marion, I think it's time we talked about why Howard didn't want Nora here today." Mom's face went pale, and she looked at Iona, then at Dad, her voice barely a whisper as she said, "What are you talking about, Iona?" Iona didn't flinch, just kept her eyes on Mom and said, "There's a letter you wrote to me 35 years ago, a letter Howard made sure never reached me, and I think it's time your daughters knew the truth." My stomach dropped, because I knew this was the secret Dad had been hiding, the one tied to that letter Lila found, and I could see the fear in his eyes as he realized he couldn't control this anymore. I grabbed Mom's arm because she looked like she might collapse, and I said, "Iona, whatever this is, can we talk about it privately? This is Mom and Dad's anniversary." Iona shook her head and said, "No. Nora, this is exactly why you're here, because you deserve to know what your father's been keeping from you and your mother." Dad lunged forward, his voice hoarse, and said, "That's enough, Iona. You have no right to come in here and ruin our day." But Mom pulled away from me, her face a mix of confusion and anger, and said, "Howard, what is she talking about? What letter?" The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop, and I felt like I was holding my breath, waiting for the truth to come out. Iona looked at Mom with this sad kind of resolve and said the letter was about a promise we made before you married Howard, a promise he made sure you broke. I didn't know what that meant, but it hit Mom like a punch. She staggered back, and Lila caught her whispering, "Mom, are you okay?" I turned to Dad and said, "Tell us the truth right now, what did you do?" He just stood there, his hands shaking, and for the first time in my life I saw him look small, like a man who'd run out of lies. I felt this strange mix of anger and clarity because whatever Iona was about to say was going to change our family forever, and I was ready to face it no matter how much it hurt. The community hall in Cedar Grove was like a pressure cooker after Iona Merritt dropped her bombshell about a 35-year-old letter my mom Marion, who we call Mari, wrote to her, a letter my dad Howard, who everyone calls Howie, made sure never reached her, and I was standing there holding Mom's arm because she looked like she might collapse under the weight of whatever secret was unraveling. My sister Lila Prescott was next to Mom, her face pale as she whispered for her to sit down, but Mom just kept staring at Iona, then at Dad, her eyes full of confusion and hurt as she demanded to know what letter and what promise. Dad was frozen, his hands shaking like he'd been caught in a lie he couldn't talk his way out of, and I felt this mix of anger and determination because I was done with his games. I wanted the truth, and I wasn't leaving until I got it. I looked at Dad and said, You need to explain this right now. What did you do 35 years ago that's got Iona showing up here tearing our family apart? The guests around us, aunts and uncles like Cliff Hargrove and Fern Whitaker, were whispering their faces a mix of shock and curiosity, but I didn't care about them. I cared about Mom, who was trembling as she waited for Dad to speak. Iona stepped closer, her voice steady but heavy with years of pain, and said, "Marion, the letter was about a choice you made before you married Howard, a choice he forced you to walk away from, and it cost me everything." Mom gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, and I felt my stomach twist because I had no idea what Iona meant, but it was like a knife, cutting through the room. Dad finally found his voice shouting, "Iona, you're out of line. This is our anniversary. You have no right to drag up ancient history in front of everyone." But Mom turned to him, her voice sharp, and said, "Howard, if there's something I need to know, you tell me now, or I swear I'll walk out that door and not look back." I could barely breathe as Mom's words hung in the air, and I realized this wasn't just about me or Dad's grudge against my career. This was something deeper, something that had been buried for decades. I pulled Mom toward a corner of the hall away from the staring guests and said, "We need to talk this out, just us, because I wasn't letting this ruin her day any more than it already had." Lila followed us, her boyfriend Silas Morrow trailing behind, looking guilty like he hadn't meant to set off this chain reaction when he announced I was his boss at Pinnacle Tech. Iona didn't move, just watched us with this sad, determined look like she'd waited years for this moment. Dad tried to follow, but Aunt Fern grabbed his arm and said, "Howard, give them space, you've done enough," and I was grateful because I needed to focus on Mom. We found a small side room off the hall used for storage, and I sat Mom down on a folding chair, her hand still clutching the photo album I'd given her, the one I'd spent $3,000 restoring with pictures of her family. She looked at me, her eyes wet, and said, "Nora, I don't understand what's happening. I wrote a letter to Iona years ago, but it was just a goodbye. I never thought it would come to this." I asked her what the letter was about, what promise Iona was talking about, and she took a shaky breath and said, "Before I married your father, I was engaged to someone else, a man named Thomas, Iona's brother, and I broke it off because Howard convinced me it was the right thing to do." I felt like the floor dropped out from under me because I'd never heard about any engagement, never knew Mom had a whole life before Dad that he'd kept hidden from us. Lila's eyes went wide and she said, "Mom, why didn't you ever tell us?" And Mom shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks as she said it was a long time ago. I thought it was behind me, but the letter was my way of explaining to Iona why I couldn't marry Thomas, why I had to let him go. I asked what happened to Thomas, and Mom's voice broke as she said he died in a car accident 6 months after I broke the engagement, and Iona always blamed me, thought I drove him to it. That hit me like a punch, because I could see the guilt Mom had carried all these years, and I realized Dad must have known, must have pushed her to bury it, so he could have her to himself. I was furious, but I kept my voice steady and said, "Mom, this isn't your fault. Whatever Dad did to keep that letter from Iona, we're going to figure it out together." Silas, who'd been quiet this whole time, spoke up and said, "Nora, I didn't mean to make things worse by saying you're my boss, but maybe I can help. I heard something at work about a legal settlement. Pinnacle Tech paid out years ago tied to a car accident in Cedar Grove." I stared at him, my mind racing because Pinnacle Tech was my company, and if they were connected to Thomas's death, that meant Dad might have had a hand in something much bigger than a hidden letter. I asked Silas what he knew, and he said it was just office talk. Something about a factory worker who got a big payout to stay quiet after an accident, but he didn't have details. I felt this cold clarity settle over me because I knew I had to dig into this. I had access to Pinnacle's records, and I wasn't letting Dad hide anymore. I stepped out of the side room, leaving Mom with Lila and Silas because I needed to confront Dad before he could spin another story. The hall was still buzzing with guests, but Dad was by the refreshment table looking like a cornered animal. I walked right up to him and said, "We need to talk about Thomas and the letter, and don't even think about lying to me because I'm going to find out the truth one way or another." His face crumpled for a second, but then he got defensive and said, "You don't know what you're talking about." Nora, this is ancient history. It's got nothing to do with you. I leaned in close so only he could hear and said, if Pinnacle Tech paid someone off to cover up Thomas's death, and you were involved, I'll make sure everyone knows even if it costs me my job. He flinched like I'd hit him, and for the first time I saw real fear in his eyes, not just anger. Before he could answer, Iona appeared beside us, her voice low, and said, Howard, you can't keep running from this. You worked at that factory. You knew what they did to cover up Thomas's accident. Dad shouted, That's enough, Iona. You're ruining everything. But his voice cracked, and I could tell he was unraveling. I didn't back down, I said. Dad, if you know something about Thomas's death, you need to come clean now because Mom deserves to know. And so do I. He looked at me, then at Iona, and I saw something break in him like he knew the walls were closing in. I turned to the guests who were staring and said, I'm sorry, this isn't how we wanted to celebrate Mom and Dad's anniversary, but I need a minute with my family. I grabbed Dad's arm and pulled him toward the side room where Mom and Lila were, because I wasn't letting this drag out in front of everyone. Mom stood up when we walked in, her face hard with anger, and said, Howard, tell me the truth. Did you have something to do with Thomas's death? Dad sank into a chair, his hands covering his face, and said, It wasn't like that. I didn't cause the accident, but I knew the factory was cutting corners on safety, and after Thomas died, they paid me to keep quiet. I felt sick because I'd spent my career at Pinnacle Tech cleaning up messes like that, and now I was finding out my own father was part of one. I looked at Mom and said, We're going to get to the bottom of this, I promise. And I felt this fierce determination because I wasn't just fighting for her, I was fighting for the truth. We'd all been denied for so long. I knew things would never be the same, but for the first time I felt like we were starting to piece together the real story of our family, and I was ready to face whatever came next. I was still shaking from everything that went down in that storage room off the Cedar Grove Community Hall, where my dad Howard, who we call Howie, admitted he took a payout to stay quiet about a factory's safety failures that killed Thomas, the man my mom Marion, who we call Mari, was engaged to, before Dad and I could see the pain in Mom's eyes like a wound that had never healed. My sister Lila Prescott was holding Mom's hand, her face a mix of shock and anger, as she looked at Dad, who was slumped in a chair looking smaller than I'd ever seen him, and I knew right then I had to decide how to handle this truth that had torn our family apart at their 35th wedding anniversary celebration. I stood up, my voice firm even though my heart was pounding, and said, Dad, you've got to stop hiding. You need to tell Mom everything, because we're not living with secrets anymore. He looked up, his eyes glassy, and said, Nora, I swear I didn't mean for anyone to get hurt. I took the money because we were struggling, and I thought I was saving Mari from a life she didn't want. Mom's voice was raw as she said, saving me by letting me carry the guilt of Thomas's death for 35 years. You stole my chance to make peace with Iona. That hit me hard because I realized Dad's lies hadn't just hurt Mom, they'd shaped our whole family, and I wasn't letting that continue. I turned to Lila and said, We need to bring Iona in here because she's part of this, and she deserves to know what really happened. Lila nodded, her eyes fierce, and we stepped back into the hall to find Iona Merritt, the woman who'd brought that 35-year-old letter to light and turned our world upside down. The hall was quieter now, guests like Aunt Fern Whitaker and Uncle Cliff Hargrove starting to leave their faces full of questions they didn't dare ask. Iona was standing by a table talking to Lila's boyfriend Silas Morrow, who'd set this whole thing off by saying I was his boss at Pinnacle Tech, and I walked up to her and said, Iona, we're ready to talk, no more secrets, just the truth about Thomas and the letter. She looked at Mom, who'd come out behind me, her expression softening as she said, Marion, I never wanted to ruin your day. I just needed you to know I didn't abandon you all those years ago. Mom's eyes filled with tears and she said, Iona, I thought you got my letter. I wrote to explain why I couldn't marry Thomas. I had no idea Howard kept it from you. Iona took a deep breath and said, I blamed you for so long, but when I learned about the factory's cover-up, I knew Howard was hiding more than just a letter. I felt this burn of anger at Dad, but also a clear focus because I wasn't letting this destroy us. I was going to find a way forward. I said, Iona, I'm going to dig into Pinnacle Tech's records to see what they paid Dad and why, and if there's any way to make this right, I'll do it. She nodded, her voice quiet but firm, and said, I don't need justice anymore, Nora. I just need closure for my brother. That moment felt like a promise, not just to Iona, but to Mom and Lila, that we'd face this together, no matter how messy it got. I pulled Silas aside because he'd mentioned that rumor about a Pinnacle Tech payout tied to a Cedar Grove accident, and I needed every detail he had. He looked uneasy, but said, It's just talk from some older engineers at the Indianapolis branch about a worker getting $50,000 to stay quiet after a crash 30 years ago, but nobody knew the full story. I felt this knot in my stomach because I'd spent my career at Pinnacle fixing problems like this, and now I was uncovering one my own father was tangled in. I told Silas to keep it to himself for now because I needed to handle this my way, and he agreed, looking relieved to stay out of it. I went back to Mom, who was sitting with Lila, her face tired but resolute, and I said, I'm heading to Chicago tomorrow to check Pinnacle's files, and I'll find out exactly what happened with that money. Mom grabbed my hand, her voice soft but strong, and said, Nora, you've already given me so much by being here, you don't have to carry this burden alone. I shook my head and said, I'm doing this for all of us because we deserve to know the truth and live without shadows. Lila hugged me and said, I've got your back, but don't let this consume you. And I knew she meant it because we were in this together now, stronger than ever. The rest of the anniversary party fizzled out, guests leaving with hushed goodbyes, like they knew our family had changed forever. Dad stayed in the storage room avoiding everyone, and I let him be because I needed to focus on Mom and Lila. That night at my hotel, I lay awake thinking about everything, but instead of anger, I felt this strange calm because I was finally free from trying to prove myself to Dad. The next day, I met Mom and Lila at a Cedar Grove diner for breakfast, and Mom looked worn but peaceful, like she'd found a piece of herself again. She said, Nora, I'm so sorry I didn't stand up to your father sooner. I let his words make you feel like you didn't belong, and that was wrong. I took her hand across the table and said, Mom, you were doing your best, and from now on we're building something honest. No more secrets. Lila smiled and said, I'm done letting Dad control us. We're a team now, and I felt this warmth because we were rewriting our family's story together. Mom said having you girls here is all I ever wanted for this anniversary, and I knew we'd given her something better than any party. Back in Chicago, I spent a week with my deputy director, Dexter Blaine, pulling old Pinnacle Tech records until I found a document showing a payment of $50,000 to Howard Vance for consulting tied to an unfiled safety report from 30 years ago. I didn't confront Dad with it because I realized I didn't need his confession to feel whole. I had the truth, and that was enough. I called Mom and told her what I found, and she said she was talking to Dad but wasn't sure if she could stay with him after everything. Iona and Mom started writing to each other, sharing memories of Thomas, and it seemed to help them both find some peace. Lila and I got tighter, planning trips to Chicago with Silas, who I made clear was just family at home, not my employee. Dad called me a few weeks later, his voice awkward but sincere, saying he was sorry and proud of what I'd done at Pinnacle, and it wasn't everything I wanted, but it was a step. I realized I didn't need his approval to know who I was, and that freedom felt like breathing for the first time in years. If this story hit home for you, please hit that like button and subscribe to hear more about facing hard truths and rebuilding family on your own terms. Thanks for listening to my journey. And remember, sometimes the bravest thing you can do is demand the truth, even when it hurts, because that's how you find your way to peace.